The vanilla-scented hand cream was the first thing I noticed. It was a cheap, cloying smell, the kind that lingers in small rooms long after the person has left. I stood in the hallway of the house I had lived in for 24 years, holding a plastic bag containing 2 cartons of low-sodium chicken broth and a box of chamomile tea. Through the archway, I could see the high-backed, moss-green velvet armchair by the bay window. Sonia was sitting in it. She had her shoes off, her small, pale feet tucked beneath her on the cushion. She was scrolling through her phone, her thumb making a dry, rhythmic clicking sound against the screen. On the small mahogany side table beside her, the one my father had restored for us as a wedding gift, sat a half-empty mug of herbal tea. It was resting directly on the bare wood, without the small cork coaster I kept in the drawer. A pale ring of condensation was already blooming on the dark grain. "Leon!" she called out, her voice light and thin, like paper scraping against stone. "Do we have any more of those honey wafers?" Leon's voice came from the kitchen, low and familiar, carrying that easy, accommodating tone he used when he wanted to please someone. "Check the second pantry shelf, sweetie, behind the oats." He walked into the living room then, carrying a plate with 2 small pastries. He stopped when he saw me standing by the coat rack, still holding the grocery bag. His expression didn't shift into guilt or anger. It settled into that smooth, slightly weary mask of tolerance he had worn during the last 5 years of our marriage. "Maren," he said, nodding toward the bag, "you're back early. The traffic on Route 9 must have been light." "It was," I said. My voice was quiet, lacking the sharp edge of a woman who was about to start a fight. I had lost the energy for fights somewhere around our 20th anniversary, when I realized that Leon didn't argue to resolve things. He argued to wear me down until I apologized for having an opinion. Sonia looked up from her phone. She gave me a small, polite smile, the kind reserved for a difficult landlord or a receptionist at a dentist's office. "Hi, Maren. I hope you don't mind. Leon said it was okay if I waited here while he finished up his paperwork." "The chair is fine," I said, though she hadn't actually asked about the chair. It wasn't just any chair. My mother had bought it for me when our son Gavin was born. I had spent 6 months in that chair with him during his colicky first winter, rocking back and forth in the blue-gray light of the early mornings, listening to the radiator hiss. Later, when my joints began to ache from the early stages of arthritis, it was the only seat in the house that didn't leave me stiff after 20 minutes. Leon knew this. He had helped me move it to the bay window 3 years ago, so I could have the morning light while I knitted. "I'll get a coaster for that mug," Leon said quickly, his tone efficient, as if he were managing a minor office oversight. He didn't look at me as he reached into the side table drawer, retrieved the cork coaster, and lifted Sonia's mug to slide it underneath. He did it with a gentle, protective touch, ensuring she didn't have to interrupt her scrolling. I walked past them into the kitchen. The linoleum was cold beneath my thin-soled flats. On the counter there was an open carton of oat milk, left out long enough to lose its chill, and a small smear of raspberry jam near the sink. We were still married, technically. The separation agreement had been drawn up 6 months ago, but the legal machinery of our lives was large, rusty, and slow. Because of the high interest rates and the state of our joint savings, our lawyers had advised us to remain in the house until the final division of assets was settled. Leon had taken the guest room over the garage.
I had stayed in the master bedroom, though I had moved my clothes to the smaller closet in the hall to give him space to retrieve his things without us bumping shoulders in the dark. It was an arrangement designed by practical people who didn't understand how heavy silence can weigh in a house of 3,000 square feet. I unpacked the chicken broth, placing the cartons neatly in the pantry. Behind the oats, there was indeed a packet of honey wafers. I had bought them 2 weeks ago when my daughter Tess had stopped by with her husband. Tess hadn't eaten them, but I had kept them there, tucked away. Maren? Leon's footsteps were quiet on the kitchen threshold. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slightly rounded. He had lost some of his hair over the last year, and the skin beneath his eyes looked thin, like wet parchment. "Sonia's staying for dinner. I was thinking of ordering from the trattoria down the street. Do you want me to get you something?" "No, thank you," I said. "I have the soup." "Are you sure?" He hesitated, his fingers jingling his keys inside his pocket. It was an old habit of his when he felt a faint twitch of social discomfort. "She's trying to make an effort, Maren. It's hard for her, too, coming into this middle ground." "I'm sure, Leon." I turned to face him. I kept my hands folded in front of my apron. "The trattoria's garlic bread is usually too salty for me anyway." He nodded, looking relieved that I hadn't made a scene. He had spent 30 years fearing my scenes, though I had only ever made 2 in our entire marriage. Once when he forgot Tess at the library for 4 hours when she was 7, and once when his mother told me my housekeeping was the reason our first pregnancy hadn't lasted. Both times Leon had walked out of the house and stayed at a motel until I called to apologize for overreacting. "Right," he said. "Well, we'll keep the noise down." He turned to go back to the living room. "Leon," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He stopped, his back still toward me. "Yeah?" "Tell her not to use the blue mugs," I said. "The glaze is lead-based. They're decorative." "Oh," he said, not looking back. "Okay, thanks." I stood by the stove, watching the blue flame hiss beneath the small saucepan of broth. From the living room, I heard Sonia laugh, a high musical sound that didn't belong in a house where the walls had absorbed 20 years of quiet, steady disappointment. I reached down and touched the edge of the kitchen counter. The wood was dry, desperately needing a coat of mineral oil. I had meant to oil it last month, but then I had realized that by the time the dry winter air arrived, I might not be the one standing here to look at it. I ate my soup at the small breakfast nook in the corner of the kitchen. It was a narrow, high-backed booth we had installed when the children were small, so they could do their homework while I cooked. The table was pine, scarred with light scratches from Gavin's forgotten colored pencils and Tess's high school binders. From the dining room, the scent of garlic and toasted bread drifted in, heavy and rich. I could hear the clink of silverware against our everyday stoneware plates, the white ones with the green rim that I had bought on sale at a department store when we moved in. "The light in here is really lovely," Sonia was saying. Her voice carried easily through the open double doors. "But those heavy drapes, they make it feel a bit like a funeral home, don't you think?
If we took them down and did some simple linen shears, it would open up the whole front of the house." "We'd have to ask Maren," Leon replied. His voice was lower, slightly muffled, as if he were trying to keep the conversation private, while knowing perfectly well that the acoustics of the old plaster walls made privacy impossible. "She bought those drapes when her sister passed. They were from the old estate." "Oh, of course," Sonia said quickly. Her tone was sweet, almost apologetic, but with that underlying firmness of someone who believed that old grief should have an expiration date. "I didn't mean right now, just eventually. It's such a shame to waste that southern exposure. And the velvet on that green chair, it's so beautiful, but it's starting to wear thin on the left arm. It could be recovered in something modern, a nice cream boucle, maybe?" I took a sip of the broth. It was warm, but it tasted flat. I had forgotten to salt it, but I didn't get up to find the shaker. A family is a delicate machine held together by ignored slights. For 30 years, I had been the oil in that machine, quietly absorbing the friction, smoothing over the rough edges so that Leon could believe he was a gentleman, and our children could believe they grew up in a house of perfect peace. But once you stop performing that labor, once you simply sit still and watch, the gears begin to grind against one another with a terrifying, dry heat. The phone on the counter buzzed. It was a text from Tess. "Hey, Mom, Dad said you guys were having some people over tonight. Is everything okay?" I looked at the screen for a long moment. Dad said. Leon had likely mentioned Sonia's visit to Tess in a casual, offhand way, testing the waters to see how our daughter would react. He had always used the children as buffers, sending them ahead of him like scouts into a minefield. "Sonia is here for dinner," I typed back. "Everything is quiet." I didn't add anything else. I didn't tell her that Sonia was currently suggesting we recover my mother's chair in cream boucle. I didn't tell her that my hands were cold or that the house felt like it was shrinking around me. "Leon," Sonia's voice drifted in again, accompanied by the small, sharp sound of her fork scraping her plate. "Are those the tax documents you were looking for on the sideboard, the ones from the bank?" "Yes," Leon said. "Don't touch those, please. They're complicated." "I was just looking at the envelope," she said, her tone slightly defensive. "It says second notice. Is the bank still sending those to both of you?" "It's just administrative," Leon said quickly. I heard the scrape of his chair as he stood up. "Let's get some coffee. Maren, do you have any of the decaf left?" He appeared in the kitchen doorway before I could answer. He looked at me, his eyes darting to my half-empty bowl of soup, then to the phone in my hand. There was a small patch of sweat at the collar of his blue button-down shirt. "There's decaf in the green tin," I said, pointing toward the corner cabinet. "But the grinder is loud. Sonia might find it distracting." "We can use the instant," Leon said, his voice tight. He walked over to the cabinet and opened it. His hand hovered over the tins for a second before he found the right one. "Tess texted me. She asked if you were doing all right." "I told her I was," I said. "She worries about you," he said, keeping his back to me as he filled the electric kettle. "She thinks you're too isolated here. She suggested you might want to look at those townhouses near the marina, the ones with the shared gardens. You always liked gardening." The townhouses near the marina were small, dark, and expensive. They were designed for retirees who had sold their family homes and wanted to spend their remaining years walking along the concrete docks. "I have a garden here," I said softly. Leon didn't answer. He turned on the kettle. The blue light of the switch illuminated his knuckles, which were dry and red from the autumn wind. "Sonia likes the garden," he said after a long pause. "She was saying how much she'd love to plant some lavender by the path. She says the soil looks perfect for it." "The soil is too acidic for lavender," I said. "I've spent 12 years adding lime to the hydrangea beds just to keep them blue. Lavender would rot in 3 weeks." Leon turned around. He looked at me with a strange, heavy expression. Not anger, but a kind of deep, functional impatience. "It was just a thought, Maren. You don't have to make everything so difficult." He didn't wait for my response. He took 2 mugs from the cupboard, not the blue ones, I noticed, but the white ones with the green trim, and waited for the kettle to boil. From the living room, the grandfather clock in the hall began to chime. It was 8 o'clock. The deep, brassy notes filled the kitchen, vibrating through the pine table and into my chest. It was the clock my grandfather had given us when we bought the house. Every 8 days it had to be wound with a heavy brass key that lived on top of the casing. Leon hadn't wound it in years. He always forgot. I sat in the breakfast nook and watched the steam rise from my cold soup, listening to the clock count the hours in the other room, while my husband waited for the water to be hot enough to make coffee for another woman. I washed my soup bowl in the sink. I did it slowly, using the small wooden brush to scrub the porcelain, then drying it with the tea towel that had Tuesday embroidered at the bottom in faded blue thread. It was Thursday, but the towels had long since lost their order. When the bowl was in the cupboard, I walked into the hallway. The grandfather clock stood between the dining room and the living room, a tall, dark sentinel of cherry wood and tarnished brass. I reached up to the top of the casing, my fingers finding the small, cool weight of the winding key, where it always lay, hidden behind the carved molding. Sonia was still in the green chair, her feet tucked under her again. She had a small plate of honey wafers on her lap, crumbs scattering onto her dark wool trousers. Leon was on the sofa opposite her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, holding his coffee mug with both hands. As I inserted the key into the small brass hole on the clock face, the metal gave a sharp, dry click. Both of them stopped talking. The winding of the clock is a physical process. You have to turn the key slowly, feeling the heavy iron weights rise inside the dark wooden trunk. It makes a heavy, metallic clink, clink, clink that fills the room, vibrating through the floorboards. "Maren," Leon said, his voice rising slightly to compete with the sound of the gears. "Do you have to do that right now? We're trying to talk." "If I don't wind it tonight, it will stop by midnight," I said. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the moon phase dial at the top of the clock, where a painted gold face had been slowly rising and setting for 80 years. If it stops, the weights drop too low and the pendulum gets stuck. You know how hard it is to reset. "It's just a clock, Maren," he muttered. "It's a beautiful clock," Sonia said. She leaned forward, watching my hands. "Is it an antique? My mother has one, but it doesn't have that lovely chimer. It's a bit more modern." "My grandfather brought it from Pennsylvania," I said, turning the key one last time. The weights were high now, suspended by their thick,
brass chains. He bought it with his first bonus from the steel mill. He used to say that a house without a ticking clock is just a box where people wait to die. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Sonia shifted in the chair, her hand going to her throat.
She looked at Leon, expecting him to say something, to smooth over the slightly macabre turn the conversation had taken. Leon cleared his throat. "Maren has a way with words," he said, trying to laugh it off. "Always did." "It's just so solid," Sonia said, her eyes wandering around the room, taking in the crown molding, the built-in bookshelves filled with my old paperbacks, the brick fireplace that was currently cold. "This whole place has so much character. Leon was telling me about the history. It must be so much work to keep up, though, especially now." "It is work," I said. I placed the winding key back on top of the clock. "But houses like this don't survive on their own. They require someone to pay attention to the small things." "Of course," Sonia said. She took a sip of her coffee, then looked at Leon. "We were just talking about the mortgage, Maren. Leon mentioned that the interest rate on the joint account is fixed for another year. But if you and he decide to sell, there's a lot of equity here. It could easily cover the down payment on 2 smaller places." We were talking about the mortgage. I looked at Sonia. She was 38, perhaps 40. Her skin was smooth, her hair a glossy, rich brown that probably cost more to maintain than my monthly grocery budget. She looked like a woman who had never had to worry about dry rot in the sill plates or whether the septic tank needed pumping before the first hard freeze. "The equity," I repeated softly. "Yes," Sonia said, her voice bright with the easy confidence of someone who had recently read a personal finance blog. "With the market the way it is in this neighborhood, you could get a wonderful little place near the water, and Leon and I could find something closer to his office. It just seems so much more practical than keeping this big, drafty place going on what's left." Leon didn't look at me. He had suddenly found something very interesting on the bottom of his coffee mug. His knuckles were white. "The bank notice," I said, looking directly at him. "The one Sonia saw on the sideboard. Is that what you were discussing?" "It's nothing, Maren," Leon said, his voice sharp now, the warning clear. "Just some paperwork I need to handle with the broker. It's none of your concern right now." "Actually," I said, my voice remaining perfectly level, "anything to do with the bank is my concern, since my name is the only one on the deed." Sonia's coffee mug paused halfway to her mouth. She looked from me to Leon, her brow furrowing slightly. "What?" she said, her voice losing its light, musical quality. "Leon, I thought you said—" "It's a technicality, Sonia," Leon said quickly, his face flush with a sudden dark red. "The mortgage was structured under a family trust. It's just how we did things back then, for tax purposes." "It wasn't a trust, Leon," I said. I walked to the edge of the rug, standing just outside the circle of light cast by the reading lamp. "The down payment was the inheritance my father left me. My mother insisted the house be in my name alone before she would sign over the remainder of the estate. The bank notices come to both of us because Leon is a co-signer on the home equity line of credit he took out 5 years ago for his consultancy firm." I looked at the ring of condensation Sonia's mug had left on the mahogany table. It had sunk into the wax, leaving a dull white scar. "The one he hasn't made a payment on in 4 months," I added quietly. The silence that followed was different from the silence of our marriage. Our marriage had been quiet like a snowfall, gradual, soft, burying everything under a cold, uniform blanket until you forgot the shape of the ground beneath. This silence was thin and sharp, like ice cracking over a deep pond. Sonia slowly set her mug down on the coaster. Her thumb, which had been clicking so regularly against her phone screen, was suddenly still. She looked at Leon. The glossy, polite expression she had worn all evening had vanished, replaced by a keen, analytical sharpness. "Leon," she said. Her voice was much lower now, stripped of its musical cadence. "What is she talking about?" "Maren is exaggerating, Sonia," Leon said. He stood up, but his movement was clumsy. He bumped his knee against the mahogany table, causing the mugs to rattle. He glared at me, his eyes dark with a humiliation he couldn't quite contain. "It's a joint liability. We both signed the papers for the equity line. It was an investment in our future. My firm's cash flow has just been temporarily affected by the quarter's transition." "You took $40,000 out of the house to pay for your office lease on 5th Street, I said. My voice remained soft, almost conversational. "And then you took another $20,000 to pay for the marketing campaign that didn't bring in any clients? I signed the papers because you told me you'd have to file for personal bankruptcy if I didn't. You said it would protect my credit." "Maren, stop it," Leon hissed. His face was no longer red. It had gone a dull, dusty gray. "This is not the time or the place for this. We have guests." "Sonia isn't a guest, Leon," I said. "She's the woman who is planning to buy my mother's chair and recover it in cream boucle. If she's going to live in my house, she should probably know who pays the property taxes." Sonia stood up. She was wearing a gray cashmere sweater that hung perfectly on her frame, but she looked suddenly very small, her shoulders pulled in. She didn't look at Leon. Instead, she looked down at her shoes, which were sitting neatly by the door, expensive leather loafers with small gold buckles. "I think I should go," she said. "Sonia, please," Leon said, stepping toward her. He reached out to touch her arm, but she pulled back slightly, not a dramatic flinch, just a subtle, efficient step to the side. "We're just having a misunderstanding. Maren she's bitter about the divorce. She's trying to make things look worse than they are." "I'm not bitter, Leon," I said. "I'm just tired. I've been tired for a very long time." Sonia picked up her purse from the bench by the door. She looked at me for the first time with something resembling real sight. There was no pity in her eyes, but there was a cold, calculating assessment. She was a woman who knew the value of $1, and she had just realized that the man she was with was living on borrowed time and someone else's equity. "Thank you for the tea, Maren," she said. Her voice was remarkably steady. "You're welcome," I said. "The honey wafers are in the pantry if you want to take them with you. They'll only go stale here." She didn't take them. She stepped into her loafers, opened the heavy oak front door, and walked out into the cool October night. The door didn't slam behind her. She closed it firmly, the brass latch clicking into place with a dry, final sound. Leon stood in the middle of the living room. His hands were still in his pockets, but they were clenched so tightly I could see the outline of his knuckles through the fabric of his trousers. "Are you happy now?" he asked. He didn't raise his voice, but it was thick with a cold, venomous rage. "Do you feel better? Ruining a perfectly nice evening because you can't stand to see me moving on?" "I didn't ruin your evening, Leon," I said.
walking toward the hall closet to hang up my coat, which I had been carrying over my arm this entire time. I just told the truth. You used to tell me that the truth was the most important thing in a marriage. This isn't a marriage anymore, he said, stepping after me. It's a business arrangement, and you're sabotaging it.
If it's a business arrangement, Leon, I said, turning to look at him, then you should know that the next mortgage payment is due on Tuesday. And since your consultancy firm is in a transition phase, I suggest you find a way to transfer your half of the funds to the joint account before 5 o'clock. I turned and began to walk up the stairs. The wood was solid beneath my feet, each step familiar and predictable. "Maren," he called up after me, his voice echoing in the high ceiling of the stairwell. "We have to sell this place. You know we do. You can't afford to keep it on your salary." I didn't answer him. I kept climbing, my hands sliding along the smooth, polished banister that I had wiped down with lemon oil every Saturday morning for 24 years. I woke at 5:30, before the sun had cleared the maple trees at the edge of the yard. For 24 years, my body had kept this schedule. I didn't need an alarm. The silence of the early morning was enough to pull me from sleep. Downstairs, the house was cold. The thermostat was programmed to drop to 62 degrees at night, and the old cast-iron radiators were slow to warm up. They groaned and clicked in the walls, a familiar metal heartbeat that I had listened to through winters of croup, of teenage late-night curfews, of Leon's late-night returns from networking dinners. I made a pot of black coffee. I didn't use the green tin. I used the regular breakfast blend. While the water dripped, I took a soft rag and a bottle of mineral oil from beneath the sink. I walked into the living room. The air still smelled faintly of Sonia's vanilla cream, but the room itself was dark and still. I knelt by the mahogany side table. In the pale morning light, the white ring where her mug had sat was even more distinct, a cloudy, circular scar on the dark wood. I poured a small drop of oil onto the rag and began to rub it into the wood, moving my hand in slow, circular motions. The oil darkened the surface, but the white ring remained, a stubborn shadow beneath the sheen. "You're up early," a voice said from the archway. It was Tess. She was standing there in her heavy wool coat, her car keys dangling from her index finger. She had her father's nose, slightly hooked, strong, but she had my eyes, a pale, washed-out gray that always looked like they were searching for something they had lost. "I have the early shift at the clinic," she said, stepping into the room. She didn't take off her coat. "I thought I'd stop by and see if you needed anything from the market. Dad texted me last night." "Did he?" I didn't stop rubbing the wood. "He said you were difficult," Tess said. She walked over to the sofa and sat down on the very edge of the cushion, her knees pressed together. "He said you made a scene in front of Sonia." "I didn't make a scene, Tess," I said. "I just told her who owned the house." Tess sighed, a long, weary sound that made her look much older than 27. "Mom, why does it have to be like this? He's trying to move on. Sonia is actually really nice if you give her a chance. She's been really good for him. He's been less stressed since they started seeing each other." "He's less stressed because he doesn't have to worry about his office lease anymore," I said. I set the rag down and looked at my daughter. "Did he tell you he took $60,000 out of the home equity line?" Tess looked away, her fingers tracing the seam of her leather purse. "He said it was a temporary loan. He said you agreed to it."
I signed the papers because he told me he would lose his business if I didn't, I said. And now he isn't making the payments. The bank sent a second notice, Tess. If they foreclose, this house doesn't belong to either of us. It belongs to them. He wouldn't do that, Tess said, though her voice lacked conviction. She had always been her father's defender. When she was 12, she had spent 3 weeks saving her allowance to buy him a leather wallet because she had heard him complain about being broke. He had taken the wallet, smiled, and put it in a drawer where it stayed, unused, until we packed up his things for the guest room. Dad is he's in a bad spot right now. His clients aren't paying on time. He told me he's closing a big deal next month. He's been closing a big deal next month since 2018, I said softly. I stood up, my knees cracking slightly in the quiet room. I went to the kitchen and poured 2 mugs of coffee. I brought one to Tess, placing it on the small cork coaster she had automatically reached for. A family is a strange thing, Tess, I said, sitting in the armchair opposite her, the green one. The velvet was indeed thin on the armrest, worn down by years of my own palms resting there while I thought. When you're a child, you think your parents are giants. You think they have some secret knowledge that keeps the roof from falling in. But then you grow up and you realize they're just 2 people who got tired at different times. Tess looked down at her coffee. He's still my father, Mom. I know, I said, and I don't want you to hate him. I just want you to stop carrying his debts. You don't owe him his comfort. She didn't answer. She took a sip of the coffee, her shoulders rising and falling with a shallow, nervous breath. Outside, the first crow of the morning called out from the tall pine, a sharp, lonely sound that seemed to echo through the empty spaces of the house. The sound of footsteps on the back stairs cut through the kitchen. Leon walked in, his wool coat draped over one arm and his briefcase in the other. He looked like he hadn't slept. His skin was the color of skim milk, and his tie was slightly askew, the knot sitting too low on his collar. He stopped when he saw Tess sitting at the table. "Tess," he said, his voice instantly shifting into that warm, paternal register he used whenever he needed to establish himself as the anchor of the family. "I didn't know you were coming by. You should have told me. I would have picked up some of those cinnamon rolls you like." "I was just dropping off some things for Mom," Tess said. She didn't look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on her coffee mug. "We were just talking." Leon's eyes darted to me, then to the clean pot of coffee on the counter. He set his briefcase on the linoleum with a small, heavy thud. "Maren," he said, his tone turning clinical. "About last night, I think we both need to take a breath. It was a stressful situation, and things were said that didn't need to be said." "I only said what was true, Leon," I said. "You presented a very distorted picture of our financial situation to Sonia," he said, stepping into the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, his posture casual, but his fingers were tightly gripping the edge of the wood. "Tess, your mother doesn't always understand how business credit works. A home equity line is a standard tool for small businesses. It's not a personal debt. It's an asset transition." Tess looked up. "Dad, did you miss 4 payments?" Leon's smile stiffened. It was the same smile he had given the neighbors when our dog had dug up their rose beds 10 years ago. Polite, apologetic, but entirely dismissive of the damage. "The bank has an automated system, Tess," he said. "Sometimes when you're restructuring accounts, things get flagged. It's a clerical delay.
I'm meeting with the loan officer this afternoon to clear it up. He turned back to me, his voice dropping an octave. But to do that, Maren, I need you to sign the authorization form. The bank needs both signatures to move the line into the corporate name. To move it into the corporate name, I repeated. Yes, he said, his tone eager now, sensing a path forward. Once it's under the LLC, it's completely separate from the house. Your name comes off it entirely. It's what we should have done from the start. I sat quiet for a moment. I knew how Leon's mind worked. He had spent 30 years believing that if he explained a bad idea with enough confidence, it would somehow become a good one. If I sign that, I said, the LLC becomes solely responsible for the $60,000. Exactly, Leon said. And what happens when the LLC has no assets, I asked. Your firm hasn't had a retainer client since March, Leon. The LLC is just a piece of paper in a drawer in your office. If the LLC defaults, the bank will still look at who signed the original note. They'll still look at the house. Leon's knuckles turned white against the counter. I'm trying to protect you, Maren. If you don't sign this, the bank is going to freeze the joint account. Is that what you want? No money for groceries? No money for your arthritis medication? The joint account has $94 in it, Leon, I said. I checked it this morning before I made the coffee. My pension goes into my private account now. It has for 3 months. Leon stared at me. For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear passed through his eyes. He had assumed my silence over the last 6 months was the same silence I had given him for decades. The silence of compliance, of a woman who would rather lose a little ground than start a war. He hadn't realized that my silence was the quiet, methodical clearing of my own slate. Tess stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. I have to go to work, she said. Her voice was trembling. Tess, wait, Leon said, reaching for her. Let me explain. I don't want to hear it, Dad, she said. She pulled her coat tightly around her, her eyes wet as she looked at him. Just don't call me today. I have a double shift. She walked out of the kitchen, her boots clicking down the hall. A moment later, the front door opened and closed, the sound heavier this time, as if the house itself were slowly losing its density. Leon didn't move. He stood by the counter, his chest rising and falling. "You're turning her against me," he said, his voice a low, dry rasp. "You've been doing it for months, quietly, in the dark." "I haven't had to do anything, Leon," I said. "You've been doing all the work yourself." Leon didn't leave for his office right away. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, watching me wash Tess's empty coffee mug. The water was hot, steam rising to damp my face, but I didn't turn the faucet down. "If you don't sign that paper, Maren," he said, his voice flat and clinical, "the bank will initiate the foreclosure process. They've already given us the 90-day warning. It was in the first notice, the one you conveniently didn't mention." "I didn't mention it because you intercepted it," I said, setting the clean mug on the drying rack. "I only found out because the bank sent a copy to my personal email address. They have me listed as the primary contact for the property taxes." Leon's jaw tightened. "It's a bluff. Banks don't want houses like this. They don't want the hassle of selling a mid-century colonial with an old septic system in a niche market. They want their money.
If we restructure the loan under the LLC, they get their interest and we get time." "No," I said, turning to face him. "You get time. I get $60,000 of your business debt tied to my name for another 15 years. I'm 58, Leon. I am not spending my 60s paying for your failed marketing campaigns." "I built this family," he said, stepping closer, his voice rising just enough to make the small copper pans hanging from the rack give a faint metallic vibration. "I paid for the private school tuition. I paid for Tess's braces. I paid for the trip to Italy you wanted so badly." "The trip to Italy was for our 25th anniversary," I said, "and we paid for it with the money my uncle left me. I have the receipts in the blue binder in the den, if you've forgotten." Leon looked at me as if I were a stranger. In a way, I suppose I was. For 30 years, I had been the woman who nodded, who smoothed the sheets, who made sure there was always a clean shirt in his closet and a warm meal on the table when he came home from his late-night meetings. He had mistaken my silence for absence. He had assumed that because I didn't demand recognition, I didn't see what was happening. "Fine," he said, picking up his briefcase. His voice was suddenly very quiet, very cold. "Have it your way. But if the bank takes this house, Maren, you go down with it. Don't think your precious little pension is going to save you. A judge will look at our joint assets and they will carve you up just like they carve me." He walked out. The back door clicked shut, and a moment later, the gravel in the driveway crunched as his sedan backed out and sped down the road. The house was completely still again. I walked into the den, the small dark room off the living room where I kept my sewing machine and my desk. On the wall hung a framed photograph of our family from 15 years ago. Gavin was 12, his hair wild and thick. Tess was 10, her front teeth missing, her hand tucked firmly into mine. Leon was standing behind us, his hands on our shoulders, his head tilted back with that confident, expansive smile of a man who believed he had conquered the world. I sat down at the desk and opened my laptop. My hands were steady. The phone on my desk rang. It was Gavin. He lived 3 hours away in Boston, working as a junior researcher at a biotech firm. He was different from Tess. Where Tess was soft and anxious, Gavin was dry, quiet, and deeply observant. He had spent his teenage years staying out of the house as much as possible, library books tucked under his arm, returning only to sleep. "Mom," he said when I answered, "Dad called me." "I thought he might," I said. "He asked me for $15,000, Gavin said. He sounded tired, his voice flat and practical. He said it was for an investment opportunity that would benefit the whole family. He said it was urgent." "What did you tell him, Gavin?" "I told him I didn't have that kind of money," Gavin said. "And even if I did, I wouldn't invest in his firm. I've seen his balance sheets, Mom. He sent me some files last year when he wanted me to do some free data analysis for him. The company is a ghost. It's been dead for 2 years. He's just moving money around to keep the lights on." I closed my eyes. The weight of it, the years of Leon's quiet, desperate scrambling, seemed to settle into the room like dust. "Is he still living there?" Gavin asked. "He's in the room over the garage," I said, "but he spends most of his time in the living room, or with Sonia." "Sonia," Gavin muttered, "the one with the vanilla cream. Tess told me about her.
"She sat in my chair last night, Gavin," I said, and for the first time, my voice gave a tiny, dry crack. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint hum of traffic from the Boston streets outside his window. "Don't sign anything, Mom," Gavin said softly. "Whatever he tells you, don't sign it. I'm coming down this weekend." I drove to Miller's Garden Supply on the edge of town. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the dry, sweet scent of decaying leaves and wood smoke from the surrounding hills. The garden center was quiet, filled with rows of rust-colored chrysanthemums, dried cornstalks, and plastic bags of mulch stacked high on wooden pallets. I needed 3 bags of agricultural lime to prepare the hydrangea beds for the winter freeze. It was a heavy, dusty task, but it was a ritual I had kept for 12 years. I was dragging one of the 50-pound bags onto a low, flatbed cart when a voice behind me made my hands pause on the rough plastic. "Maren, is that you?" I turned to see Ruth Miller, the owner's wife. We had known each other since our children were in kindergarten together. Ruth was a small, brisk woman with graying hair tied back in a green bandana, her fingers stained with damp soil. "Ruth," I said, offering a small, practiced smile. "Just getting the garden ready for the frost." Ruth looked at the bag of lime, then at my hands, which were slightly red from the cold air. She hesitated, her expression shifting into that soft, careful look that people always use when they are trying to decide how much of your misfortune they are allowed to acknowledge. "I saw Leon on Tuesday," she said softly, leaning against a stack of cedar planters, "at the bakery in town. He was with, well, she was quite a bit younger. I didn't want to say anything, but everyone's talking, Maren. I'm so sorry." "There's nothing to be sorry for, Ruth," I said. My voice was even, my posture straight. "Leon and I are separating. He's staying in the guest quarters until the legal details are settled." Ruth looked taken aback by my lack of distress. People expect a discarded wife to be either weeping or furious. They don't know what to do with a woman who simply states the facts as if she were reading a weather report. "Oh," Ruth said, her eyes shifting away. "Well, I suppose that's practical of you. But still, it must be very hard, after all these years. If you need any help with the heavy lifting around the yard, I can send my nephew over on Saturday. He's got a truck." "I can manage the lifting," I said, "but thank you, Ruth." I wheeled the flatbed cart to the register, paid for the lime, and loaded the heavy bags into the trunk of my station wagon myself. My back ached as I lifted the 3rd bag, a dull, familiar pull in my lower spine, but I didn't stop. I liked the physical weight of it. It was a clean sort of pain, one that had a clear cause and a predictable end. The hardest part of a public betrayal isn't the betrayal itself. It's the gentle, pitying looks from people who knew you when you were whole. They look at you as if you've been diminished, as if your identity were a glass of water that someone else had reached over and tipped onto the floor. When I returned to the house, the sun was sinking behind the hills, casting long blue shadows across the lawn. I parked the station wagon in the driveway. As I walked toward the back door, I looked up at the window of the guest room over the garage. The light was on. A thin stream of gray smoke was rising from the small chimney of the wood stove Leon had installed there 3 years ago so he could have a private study. He was up there,
probably waiting for me to go to bed so he could come down to the kitchen to find something to eat without having to look me in the eye. I carried the 3 bags of lime to the shed behind the garage, my boots crunching on the dry maple leaves. In the quiet of the yard, I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock from inside the house, a steady mechanical pulse that seemed to have taken over the empty space we had left behind. At 8 o'clock, the phone on the kitchen counter rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar area code, but I answered anyway. I stood by the window, watching the wind toss the bare branches of the oak tree against the dark sky. Maren? It was Sonia. Her voice was different from the night before, no longer light and musical, but hushed, as if she were speaking from a small, enclosed space. "Yes, Sonia," I said. I held the receiver with one hand, my other resting on the cool tile of the counter. "I'm sorry to call you so late," she said. She paused, and I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of windshield wipers in the background. She was driving. I left my leather gloves on the small table by the door, the black ones with the silk lining. I was hoping you could leave them on the porch for me. I don't want to cause another scene." "I'll put them in the mailbox," I said. "You can pick them up whenever it's convenient." "Thank you," she said. She didn't hang up. The line remained open, filled with the steady, wet hum of the road. "Maren, can I ask you something? You don't have to answer if you don't want to." "Go ahead," I said. "Leon told me that you were refusing to sign the bank papers out of spite," she said, her voice dropping lower, almost to a whisper. "He said you were trying to ruin his business because you couldn't accept that the marriage was over. He said his mother left him a trust that would cover his share of the house, but that you were blocking the release of the funds." I looked down at my hands. In the dim light of the kitchen, the skin on my knuckles looked thin, the blue veins prominent. "Leon's mother died in a municipal nursing home in Scranton 4 years ago," I said. "She didn't leave a trust, Sonia. She left $12,000 in unpaid medical bills and a funeral cost that I paid out of my personal savings so she wouldn't have to be buried in a state-assisted plot. Leon knows this. He was the one who signed the death certificate." A long silence followed. The windshield wipers on the other end of the line seemed to grow louder, a steady, mechanical heartbeat. "He told me he bought the land here," Sonia said. Her voice was very small now. "He said he drew the plans for the house himself." "The land was a wedding gift from my parents," I said, "and the plans were from a catalog we bought at a hardware store in 1998. We paid $300 for them. Leon wanted to build a modern house with concrete walls, but the bank wouldn't approve the construction loan unless we went with a traditional design." "I see," Sonia said. She sounded like a woman who had just looked down and realized the bridge she was walking on was made of painted paper. When a younger woman realizes she has been lied to by an older man, she rarely blames him first. She looks to the wife to see if the deception was a shared secret, a game they were both playing at her expense. "He told me we were going to look at those townhouses by the marina next week," she said. "He said he had already put down a holding deposit." "Leon has $84 in his personal checking account, Sonia," I said, "and the joint account has $94. If he put down a deposit, he did it with a credit card that is already near its limit." I heard a soft, ragged intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Why didn't you say anything last night?" she asked. "When I was talking about the curtains, about the chair. You just stood there." "Because you were happy," I said, "and because I was curious to see how much of my life Leon had promised you before he actually owned it." "I didn't know, Maren," she said, her voice trembling. "I swear to God, I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "The gloves will be in the mailbox. Good night, Sonia." I hung up the phone. I stood in the dark kitchen for a long time, the silence of the house settling around me like cold water. Through the window, I could see the light in the room over the garage. It was still burning, a small yellow square in the dark, entirely disconnected from the house it had been built to serve. Gavin's hatchback pulled into the driveway at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. He got out of the car, stretching his tall, thin frame. He was wearing a faded denim jacket over a gray hoodie, his dark hair slightly messy from the drive. He walked up the back steps, carrying a small canvas duffel bag. When he saw me at the door, he didn't say anything at first. He just stepped inside, set his bag down, and wrapped his arms around me. He smelled of cold air, coffee, and the stale upholstery of his old car. It was a firm, quiet hug, the kind that didn't ask for reassurance, but offered it instead. "You look tired, Mom," he said, pulling back to look at my face. "I'm fine, Gavin," I said, patting his arm. "I'm just glad you're here." "Where is he?" Gavin asked, his eyes shifting toward the stairs that led to the room over the garage. "He's up there," I said. "He hasn't come down yet." "Good," Gavin said. He unzipped his jacket. "Let's get those bags of lime out of your trunk before the ground gets any wetter. It's supposed to drizzle this afternoon." We went out to the yard. The morning was gray and damp, the grass silver with heavy dew. Gavin lifted the 50-pound bags from the station wagon as if they were nothing, carrying them over to the hydrangea beds. I followed with the metal trowel and the hand rake. The physical labor was quiet. Gavin slit the top of the first bag with his pocket knife, and the white, dusty powder spilled out onto the dark soil. He began to turn it over with a spade, his movements steady and practiced. He had worked at a landscaping yard during his college summers to help pay for his books, and he still had that quiet efficiency when working with his hands. We were halfway through the second bed when the door to the garage quarters opened. Leon walked down the wooden stairs. He had a fleece vest over a plaid shirt, his hair combed, trying to look like a man who was simply enjoying a crisp autumn weekend. He had his hands in his pockets as he walked across the damp grass toward us. "Gavin," Leon said, his voice carrying that booming, cheerful resonance he always used to mask a difficult atmosphere. "I didn't know you were coming down this weekend." "Your mother should have told me. I would have made sure we had something decent in the fridge." Gavin didn't stop spade turning. He plunged the metal blade into the earth, stepped on the shoulder of the shovel to drive it deep, and turned the white speckled dirt over. "Hey, Dad," he said without looking up. "You're doing good work there," Leon said, gesturing toward the hydrangea bed. "Though I've always thought we should put some boxwoods along this border instead, something that stays green through the winter." "Mom likes the hydrangeas," Gavin said. He leaned on the spade and finally looked at his father. His gray eyes were entirely flat. "Besides, boxwoods would block the light to the kitchen window." Leon's smile faltered slightly. He shifted his weight, his keys jingling in his pocket. "Right. Well, it was just a suggestion. Gavin, when you're done here, why don't we drive down to the hardware store? I need to pick up some weather stripping for the garage door, and we could grab a coffee. Talk about some things." "I don't need a coffee, Dad," Gavin said, "and I already told you on the phone. I don't have $15,000 to give you." The white powder from the lime was still settling in the air between them, tiny specks of calcium floating in the gray light. Leon's face darkened, the easy paternal mask slipping to reveal the sharp, anxious lines underneath. "You shouldn't speak to me like that in front of your mother, Gavin," Leon said, his voice dropping. "It's a matter of family interest. I'm trying to restructure our assets so we don't lose the equity we've spent 30 years building." "You spent 30 years spending her equity, Dad," Gavin said. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke with the cold, clinical precision of a researcher who had spent his week looking at clear data. "I did a search on the state registry last night. Your LLC has 3 active tax liens against it. The corporate registration was suspended in June for failure to pay the annual fee. There is no restructuring. You're trying to use my savings to pay off the interest on a credit line that's already in default." Leon looked from Gavin to me, his chest rising and falling. His hands came out of his pockets, his fingers twitching slightly. "You've been talking to her," Leon said, his finger pointing at me. "She's the one who gave you those files. She's been collecting papers behind my back like a thief." "I didn't need Mom to give me anything, Dad," Gavin said. "Public records are public. Anyone with a laptop and $10 can see what you've been doing. You've been running this family like a bad consultancy firm, and now the bills are due." Leon took a step back. His boots made a wet sucking sound in the damp grass. He looked very small suddenly, his shoulders hunched against the cold gray sky. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "None of you understand how hard it's been, keeping up appearances, making sure we had the right kind of life." "Whose life, Dad?" Gavin asked. "Ours or yours?" Gavin's hatchback pulled into the driveway at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. He got out of the car, stretching his tall, thin frame. He was wearing a faded denim jacket over a gray hoodie, his dark hair slightly messy from the drive. He walked up the back steps carrying a small canvas duffel bag. When he saw me at the door, he didn't say anything at first. He just stepped inside, set his bag down, and wrapped his arms around me. He smelled of cold air, coffee, and the stale upholstery of his old car. It was a firm, quiet hug, the kind that didn't ask for reassurance, but offered it instead. "You look tired, Mom," he said, pulling back to look at my face. "I'm fine, Gavin," I said, patting his arm. "I'm just glad you're here." "Where is he?" Gavin asked, his eyes shifting toward the stairs that led to the room over the garage. "He's up there," I said. "He hasn't come down yet." "Good," Gavin said. He unzipped his jacket. "Let's get those bags of lime out of your trunk before the ground gets any wetter. It's supposed to drizzle this afternoon." We went out to the yard. The morning was gray and damp, the grass silver with heavy dew. Gavin lifted the 50-pound bags from the station wagon as if they were nothing, carrying them over to the hydrangea beds. I followed with the metal trowel and the hand rake. The physical labor was quiet. Gavin slit the top of the first bag with his pocket knife, and the white, dusty powder spilled out onto the dark soil. He began to turn it over with a spade, his movements steady and practiced. He had worked at a landscaping yard during his college summers to help pay for his books, and he still had that quiet efficiency when working with his hands. We were halfway through the second bed when the door to the garage quarters opened. Leon walked down the wooden stairs. He had a fleece vest over a plaid shirt, his hair combed, trying to look like a man who was simply enjoying a crisp autumn weekend. He had his hands in his pockets as he walked across the damp grass toward us. "Gavin," Leon said. his voice carrying that booming, cheerful resonance he always used to mask a difficult atmosphere. "I didn't know you were coming down this weekend. Your mother should have told me. I would have made sure we had something decent in the fridge." Gavin didn't stop spade turning. He plunged the metal blade into the earth, stepped on the shoulder of the shovel to drive it deep, and turned the white speckled dirt over. "Hey, Dad," he said, without looking up. "You're doing good work there," Leon said, gesturing toward the hydrangea bed. "Though I've always thought we should put some boxwoods along this border instead. Something that stays green through the winter." "Mom likes the hydrangeas," Gavin said. He leaned on the spade and finally looked at his father. His gray eyes were entirely flat. Besides, boxwoods would block the light to the kitchen window. Leon's smile faltered slightly. He shifted his weight, his keys jingling in his pocket. "Right, well, it was just a suggestion. Gavin, when you're done here, why don't we drive down to the hardware store? I need to pick up some weather stripping for the garage door, and we could grab a coffee. Talk about some things." "I don't need a coffee, Dad," Gavin said. "And I already told you on the phone, I don't have $15,000 to give you." The white powder from the lime was still settling in the air between them, tiny specks of calcium floating in the gray light. Leon's face darkened, the easy paternal mask slipping to reveal the sharp, anxious lines underneath. "You shouldn't speak to me like that in front of your mother, Gavin," Leon said, his voice dropping. "It's a matter of family interest. I'm trying to restructure our assets so we don't lose the equity we've spent 30 years building." "You spent 30 years spending her equity, Dad," Gavin said. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke with the cold, clinical precision of a researcher who had spent his week looking at clear data. "I did a search on the state registry last night. Your LLC has 3 active tax liens against it. The corporate registration was suspended in June for failure to pay the annual fee. There is no restructuring. You're trying to use my savings to pay off the interest on a credit line that's already in default." Leon looked from Gavin to me, his chest rising and falling. His hands came out of his pockets, his fingers twitching slightly. "You've been talking to her," Leon said, his finger pointing at me. "She's the one who gave you those files. She's been collecting papers behind my back like a thief." "I didn't need Mom to give me anything, Dad," Gavin said. "Public records are public. Anyone with a laptop and $10 can see what you've been doing. You've been running this family like a bad consultancy firm, and now the bills are due." Leon took a step back. His boots made a wet, sucking sound in the damp grass. He looked very small suddenly, his shoulders hunched against the cold gray sky. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "None of you understand how hard it's been, keeping up appearances, making sure we had the right kind of life." "Whose life, Dad?" Gavin asked. "Ours or yours?" The sound of tires on gravel broke the quiet of the kitchen. I thought it was Leon returning, but the engine was too small, too high-pitched. A moment later, Tessa's blue sedan appeared through the rain-streaked window. She parked crookedly behind Gavin's hatchback, her windshield wipers still thrashing against the glass. She got out of the car, her head ducked against the cold rain, her yellow nurse's scrubs visible beneath her open coat. She didn't knock. She burst through the back door, her face flushed, her eyes bright with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "Gavin," she said, before she had even closed the door, "why is Dad calling me from the parking lot of the diner in town, crying? He says you're trying to force him out of the house. He says you're trying to make him homeless." Gavin didn't stand up. He kept his hands flat on the pine table, his expression steady, almost patient. "Tess, take off your coat. Sit down." "I don't want to sit down," she said, her voice rising, her hand clenching the strap of her bag. "I've just worked a 12-hour shift at the clinic. I have patients who are 70 years old and don't have anyone to take care of them. And then I have to come here and deal with my own family treating each other like enemies. Why can't we just talk about this like normal people? Why does everything have to be so hostile?" "Tess," I said gently, "look at the screen." She stopped. She looked at me, her brow furrowing, her defensive posture softening just a fraction at the quietness of my voice. She looked at Gavin, who was turning the laptop so it faced her empty chair. "What is that?" she asked, her voice dropping. "It's the deed registry from the county," Gavin said. "Just look at the signatures." Tess walked over to the table. She didn't sit, but she leaned forward, her wet hair falling over her shoulder as she squinted at the blue light of the monitor. She read the document, her eyes scanning the legal jargon, then moving down to the signature lines. "Maren Vance," she read aloud. She paused. "That's your signature, Mom. So what? You signed the mortgage. You agreed to it." "Read the date, Tess," Gavin said. "March 14th, 2022, she said. She stood up straight. Her face didn't change immediately. She was still searching for a way to make the numbers and the names fit into the story she had built about her father. "March 14th, she repeated. That was the week you had your knee replaced, Mom. You were in the recovery wing at St. Luke's." "I was," I said. "I was on a morphine drip for 3 days, Tess. I couldn't even manage to hold a cup of ice water, let alone sign a $95,000 bank deed in front of a notary." Maybe you signed it before you went in." Tess's voice was growing thin, her fingers twisting the hem of her scrubs. "You knew the surgery was coming up. Maybe you did it as a precaution." "The document was drawn up and printed on March 12th, Gavin said, pointing to the electronic timestamp at the top of the file. "Mom was already admitted, and the notary who witnessed the signature is Arthur Peters. He's Dad's accountant. His office is 40 miles from the hospital. Do you really think Mom rode 40 miles in an ambulance to sign a bank deed in a strip mall office?" Tess looked at the screen again. A daughter's love for her father is often the last thing to die in a family, surviving long after the husband's honor has turned to dust. She had spent her entire life believing in Leon's warmth, his easy generosity, his status as the big, protective man who held our world together. To accept that he had forged her mother's name to take $95,000 out of the house was to accept that her childhood had been built on a foundation of sand. "Why would he do that?" she whispered. Her knees seemed to give way, and she finally sat down in the chair opposite Gavin. She didn't look at either of us. She just stared at the small, slanted letters of my name on the screen. Why would he need that much money? His firm was sued by a subcontractor in 2021, Gavin said. They settled out of court for $80,000. He didn't have the money, Tess. He was going to go to jail for corporate fraud if he didn't pay the settlement. So he took the money from the house. And he didn't tell her, Tess said. It wasn't a question. No, I said. He didn't tell me. Tess covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders began to shake, her quiet sobs the only sound in the kitchen besides the steady, heavy drumming of the rain against the window pane. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. Her skin was cold, damp from the rain, and she didn't pull away. Tess pulled her hands away from her face. Her eyes were red, her mascara smeared into dark smudges beneath her lower lashes. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of childlike hope and desperate fear. "Mom," she said, her voice small, "what do we do? If we go to the police, if we tell them he signed your name, what happens to him?" "He'll be arrested, Tess," Gavin said. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on his sister. "Forgery of a bank deed is a felony. In this state, with $95,000 involved, it carries a mandatory minimum sentence. Arthur Peters would lose his notary license, and Dad would likely go to prison." Tessa's breath hitched. "But he's 59. He has high blood pressure, Gavin. He wouldn't survive that." She turned to me, her hand reaching out again, her fingers gripping my sleeve. "Mom, please, there has to be another way. Can't we borrow against his business? Or maybe I can take out a loan. I have some savings from my clinic job. It's not $95,000, but it's something." "No, Tess," I said. My voice was very quiet, but it was firm. "You are not going into debt to pay for your father's lies. You've worked 12-hour shifts for 5 years to build your own life. You are not giving it away to buy him another year of pretension." "But the house, Mom." "The house is just wood and glass, Tess," I said. "I love it. I raised you here. But I am not sacrificing you or Gavin to keep the roof over my head." Before Tess could answer, the latch on the back door clicked. The door opened, and Leon walked in. He had his umbrella folded in his hand, water dripping from the black fabric onto the clean linoleum of the kitchen floor. He looked haggard, his face pale, his hair plastered to his forehead by the rain. He stopped when he saw the 3 of us sitting at the table, the blue light of the laptop screen illuminating our faces. He looked at Tessa's red eyes, and his posture instantly stiffened. "I see," he said. His voice was cold, his paternal warmth entirely gone. "You've had your little tribunal. You've brought the boy down from Boston to help you carve me up." "Dad," Tess said, her voice cracking. She stood up, her hand pressing against the edge of the pine table. "Did you sign Mom's name?" Leon didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on me, his mouth set in a hard, defensive line. "Your mother and I had an understanding, Tess. When she went into the hospital, we talked about the finances. We agreed that the equity in this house belonged to both of us, and that we would use whatever resources we had to protect my business. I was on a ventilator for 24 hours after the surgery, Leon," I said. "And when I came off it, I couldn't remember my own sister's name for 3 days. We didn't agree to anything." "You knew we had bills, Maren," he shouted suddenly, his umbrella hitting the floor with a loud, hollow clatter. It was the first time he had raised his voice in years, and the sound seemed to shake the small kitchen. "You knew the firm was struggling. You sat in that green chair every day, knitting your little sweaters, looking out the window, pretending you didn't know where the money came from for the groceries, for the cars, for the college tuition. You wanted the life, Maren. You just didn't want to see the blood on the floor. The money for the groceries came from my pension, Leon, I said. I stood up, my knees solid, my hands resting on the back of my chair. And the college tuition was paid off by the sale of my father's bonds. I have the bank statements in the den. I've had them for years. Leon took a step back. His eyes darted to Gavin, then to Tess, who was watching him with a look of horror that seemed to age her 10 years in a second. "Tess," he said, his voice dropping into a desperate, pleading whisper, "you know me. You know I'm not a bad man. I did it for us. I did it to keep the family together." "You did it for yourself, Dad," Tess said. Her voice didn't shake this time. It was flat, empty of all the warmth she had carried for him since she was a little girl. "You forged Mom's name. You stole from her while she was in a hospital bed." "It wasn't stealing," he cried. "The house is mine, too. I paid the mortgage for 20 years. "No, Leon," I said, "you didn't. You paid the insurance. I paid the principal from my father's estate. The bank records show every payment came from my private account. I've spent 30 years letting you believe you were the provider because I thought your pride was worth the silence. But I was wrong." I walked over to the back door and picked up his wet umbrella. I handed it to him, the metal handle cold against my palm. "The rain has stopped, Leon," I said. "I think you should leave." Leon looked at the wet umbrella in his hand. He looked at Tess, his eyes pleading for some sign of the devotion she had given him for 27 years. But she kept her face turned toward the window, her hand holding her elbow as if she were cold. He looked at Gavin, whose face was as still and unforgiving as granite. "You'll regret this, Maren," Leon said. His voice was no longer loud. It had gone flat and hollow, the sound of a man who had finally run out of arguments. "You think you can survive here alone, in this drafty old place? You'll be begging me to come back before the first snow." "I've been alone in this house for 15 years, Leon," I said. "Having you in the room over the garage didn't change the temperature." He turned and walked out. He didn't slam the door. He closed it with a soft, deliberate click that felt more final than any shout. A moment later, we heard his car start, the headlights sweeping across the kitchen ceiling as he backed out of the driveway and drove down the road into the dark. The silence that returned to the kitchen was heavy, almost physical, like the mist that rose from the river after a storm. Tess sank back into her chair, her shoulders hunched. Gavin stood up, walked to the stove, and turned off the kettle, which had begun to hiss again. "We need to eat something," I said. My voice sounded strange in the quiet room, normal, practical, entirely disconnected from the collapse of our lives. "Tess, when was the last time you had lunch?" "I don't remember," she whispered. I went to the refrigerator. I took out a carton of eggs, a stick of butter, and a loaf of sourdough bread. I began to make scrambled eggs. The physical movements, cracking the shells against the side of the ceramic bowl, whisking them with a fork, melting the butter in the cast iron skillet, were grounding. It was a language I knew how to speak when everything else had failed. A house is never quieter than in the hours after a monster has been named. Everyone walks softly, as if afraid to wake the memory of what was lost.
We ate our eggs in silence at the pine table, the only sound the scrape of forks against the stoneware plates. "I have a friend from college," Gavin said, setting his fork down. "Her name is Maren. She's an estate and real estate lawyer in town. I called her before I came down. She's willing to meet with us on Monday morning at 9. "Will she help us with the bank?" Tess asked, her voice still raw. "She'll help us protect Mom," Gavin said. "She'll look at the power of attorney Dad used. If he exceeded his authority under the family trust, we can file for a temporary injunction to stop the foreclosure while we sort out the signature issue." "But the police," Tess looked at me, her eyes wide. "Mom, do we have to?" "Let's see what Marianne says first, Tess," I said, reaching over to pat her hand. "One step at a time." After dinner, Gavin and Tess went up to their old bedrooms. I heard them moving around upstairs, the creak of the floorboards in Gavin's room, the sound of the bathroom faucet running as Tess washed her face. It had been years since both of them had slept under this roof at the same time. I should have felt some comfort in having them near, but instead, the house felt crowded with their anxiety, with the weight of the childhoods they were currently mourning. At midnight, I was still awake. I sat in the green velvet armchair by the bay window in the living room. The room was dark. The only light, the blue-gray glow of the street lamp, filtering through the bare branches of the maple tree. I had my mother's old wool blanket over my knees. The velvet beneath my hands felt thin, indeed worn down to the gray thread on the left armrest. I looked out at the empty driveway. Suddenly, a pair of headlights swept across the grass. A car was turning into the drive, moving slowly, without its high beams on. It wasn't Leon's sedan. It was too large, a dark SUV that parked near the edge of the lawn, its engine idling with a low, heavy purr. The driver's side door opened, and a silhouette emerged, stepping into the dim light of the driveway. It was Sonia. I stood up from the green chair, my knees stiff from the chill of the room, and walked to the front door. I opened it before Sonia could reach the brass knocker. The night air was thick with mist, carrying the sharp, cold scent of wet cedar and fallen leaves. Sonia stood on the porch, her dark hair damp, her face pale under the amber light of the carriage lamp. She was wearing her heavy wool coat, but she was shivering, her shoulders pulled in toward her chest. Under her arm, she clutched a thick, yellow manila envelope. "Maren," she whispered. Her voice was thin, catching in her throat. "I'm sorry. I know it's late. I didn't know where else to go." "Come inside, Sonia," I said, stepping aside to let her into the warm hallway. "The children are sleeping upstairs, so we need to keep our voices down." She nodded quickly, stepping onto the small Persian rug in the entryway. She didn't take off her coat. She stood there, her boots dripping water onto the dark wood floor, her eyes darting toward the stairs, as if she expected Gavin or Tess to appear at any moment. "Leon came to my apartment an hour ago," she said, her voice a low, hurried rasp. He wasn't himself, Maren. He was pacing, yelling, saying that you and Gavin were trying to ruin him. He had these with him." She held out the manila envelope.
Her hand was trembling so much that the paper gave a sharp, dry rattle.
I took the envelope and opened the flap. Inside was a set of legal documents. I pulled them out, holding them under the dim light of the hallway lamp. They were quitclaim deeds for the back acre of our property, the wooded parcel that bordered the creek, the one my father had spent 30 years clearing and maintaining. At the bottom of the deeds, there was a line for my signature, and beside it, a line for a witness and a mobile notary. He wanted me to sign them, Sonia whispered. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with a cold, retrospective terror. He had a mobile notary booked for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, a Sunday. He told me the notary was a friend of his who wouldn't ask too many questions. He wanted me to use my ID, but he had a fake driver's license, Maren, with my photo on it, but with your name, Maren Vance. I looked at the documents. The fake license was slipped into a plastic sleeve inside the envelope. It was a crude copy, the laminate slightly too thick, the blue background of the state seal a shade too dark. But in the dim light of a Sunday morning, to a notary who was being paid $500 to look the other way, it probably would have passed. A desperate man does not seek a way out. He seeks a partner to share the weight of his fall. Leon had spent his life believing that every woman was a resource to be managed, a vessel to be filled with his own expectations. He had assumed that because Sonia was younger, because she loved him, she would slide easily into the role of his accomplice, just as he had assumed I would slide into the role of his silent victim. I told him no, Sonia said, her voice cracking. I told him he was out of his mind. He grabbed my wrist, Maren. He's never been physical with me before, but he grabbed me so hard I couldn't get away. He said if I didn't do this, the bank would take everything, and we'd both be ruined.
He said you were a bitter, dried-up old woman who didn't deserve the land anyway. She pulled back her sleeve, revealing her pale wrist. There was already a faint purple-red shadow blooming on the delicate skin near her thumb, the distinct shape of 4 fingers. I looked at the mark on her wrist, then at the fake license with my name on it. "Where is he now, Sonia?" I asked. "I locked myself in the bathroom," she said, a tear finally escaping and running down her cheek, leaving a pale trail through her makeup. "I told him I was going to call the police. I heard him tearing up my living room, looking for his keys. Then he left. I think he went toward the highway. I waited 10 minutes, then I got in my car and came here." She looked at me, her eyes pleading for some kind of direction. She was 38 years old, a woman with a career and her own apartment, but tonight she looked like a child who had wandered into a deep woods and couldn't find her way back to the road. "You did the right thing, Sonia," I said. I placed my hand on her shoulder. Her coat was wet, but her body felt warm beneath the wool. "Go into the kitchen. I'll make some tea. We're going to call the police now." The kitchen was cold. I turned on the small burner under the kettle, its blue ring of flame casting a sharp, flickering shadow against the cabinets. Sonia sat at the pine table, her hands wrapped around her elbows, still shivering. I went to the phone on the wall and dialed the non-emergency number for the local township police. My voice was level, almost clinical, as I explained to the dispatcher that a woman had been assaulted by my husband and was currently at my house, and that we had evidence of an attempted identity theft. Before the dispatcher could finish taking my address, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Gavin came down first, his dark hair messy, his gray sweatpants dragging on the floorboards. Tess followed a few steps behind him, her face pale, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her oversized sweater. Both of them stopped in the kitchen doorway, taking in the scene. The young woman shivering at our table, the thick manila envelope lying open under the cabinet light, and me holding the phone. "What's going on?" Gavin asked, his eyes immediately fixing on Sonia. "Sonia," Tess whispered, her nurse's training instantly overriding her confusion. She walked quickly to the table, her eyes dropping to Sonia's exposed wrist, where the 4 purple-red finger marks were already darkening. "What happened to your arm?" "He grabbed me," Sonia said, her voice barely a breath. She looked up at Tess, her eyes filled with shame. "Leon, he wanted me to sign some papers, to pretend to be your mother." Tess didn't ask any more questions. She went to the freezer, took out a bag of frozen peas, wrapped it in a clean tea towel, the one embroidered with Tuesday, and gently placed it against Sonia's wrist. "Keep some pressure on it," Tess said softly. "It'll help with the swelling." 10 minutes later, the blue and red lights of a police cruiser swept across the kitchen walls. The rain had stopped, but the mist outside caught the light, turning the driveway into a swirling, neon-lit stage. Officer Raymond, a middle-aged patrolman with a kind, tired face and a thick mustache, walked into the kitchen. He took off his wet cap, holding it under his arm as he listened to Sonia's story. He was methodical. He took out a small black notebook, writing with a silver ballpoint pen that clicked loudly in the quiet room. He looked at the fake driver's license with my name and Sonia's photo. He touched the edge of the laminate with his thumb. "This is a federal offense," Raymond said, his voice low and heavy. "Manufacture of a fraudulent state document. And with the quitclaim deeds, your husband was trying to transfer real estate under false pretenses. That's a Class 3 felony." He turned to Sonia. "Do you want to press charges for the assault, ma'am?" "Yes," Sonia said. Her voice didn't tremble this time. "I do." Raymond nodded, writing in his book. "We'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow morning to make a formal statement and have the wrist photographed by the county sheriff's office. For now, I'm putting out an APB on Leon Vance. What's he driving?" "A silver Buick sedan," Gavin said. "License plate JKR 924. There's a scratch on the passenger side door from when he hit a shopping cart last winter." Raymond spoke into the small radio clipped to his shoulder, his voice crackling with static as he relayed the vehicle description to the dispatcher. When he finished, he looked at me. There was a look of quiet, professional pity in his eyes, the kind of look reserve officers give to wives who have spent decades protecting men who eventually collapse under the weight of their own greed. "Mrs. Vance," Raymond said, "we actually had a call from the state police about 40 minutes ago. A silver Buick matching that description was found parked on the shoulder of the bridge over the Delaware River, about 12 miles north of here." Tess let out a small, sharp gasp, her hand going to her mouth. Gavin stood perfectly still, his eyes widening. "Was he in it?" I asked. My voice didn't shake. I felt a strange, cold numbness spreading through my chest, as if the winter had finally arrived inside the room. "No, ma'am," Officer Raymond said. "The car was empty. The hazard lights were blinking, and the driver's side door was left wide open. The keys were still in the ignition."
"Oh, God," Tess whispered. She slid into the chair next to Sonia, her knees completely giving out. Her hands were shaking so much she had to press them flat against the pine table to keep them still. "No, no, he wouldn't. Mom, tell me he wouldn't do that." I didn't answer her. I looked at Officer Raymond, whose face was set in that neutral, professional mask of a man who had delivered this kind of news to dozens of families. "Are they dragging the river?" Gavin asked. His voice was remarkably steady, but I could see the small muscle in his jaw twitching, a tight, rhythmic pulse beneath his skin. "The state police have a marine unit on standby," Raymond said, "but the current is very fast right now because of the autumn rains. If he went over, the recovery process is complicated. We've also dispatched a canine unit to search the woods on the Pennsylvania side of the bridge. Sometimes people park the car to make a statement, but they end up walking." To make a statement. The words hung in the cold kitchen air like frost. A dramatic man always choreographs his exit, ensuring that even his absence leaves a stain of guilt on the people he left behind. Leon had spent 30 years using his vulnerability as a weapon. Whenever I had threatened to leave, whenever the financial pressure had grown too heavy, he would develop sudden, terrifying chest pains that disappeared the moment I agreed to stay. He would walk out into the winter nights without a coat, waiting for us to drive around the neighborhood in a panic, looking for him, until we found him sitting on a park bench, shivering, waiting to be rescued. "He didn't jump," Gavin said. He stood by the sink, his arms crossed over his chest. "He's too selfish to jump." "Gavin, stop it," Tess cried, her voice cracking as she glared at her brother. "He's our father. How can you say that right now?" "Because I know him, Tess," Gavin said. "He leaves the keys in the ignition and the door wide open, so the police will find the car immediately. He wants us to be terrified. He wants Mom to feel like she pushed him over that railing so we won't look too closely at the $95,000 he stole." "That's enough, Gavin," I said. My voice was quiet, but both of them stopped. I turned to Officer Raymond. "Thank you, officer. Please let us know if the state police find anything. We'll be here." Raymond nodded, clicked his silver pen one last time, and put his notebook in his breast pocket. He gave Sonia a reassuring pat on her uninjured shoulder, adjusted his cap, and walked out the back door. The blue and red lights in the driveway died, replaced by the yellow warmth of the headlights as the cruiser backed out and disappeared into the mist. We were left in the kitchen. Sonia looked at me, her eyes hollow, the towel-wrapped bag of peas still pressed to her purple, bruised wrist. "Maren, I'm so sorry. If I hadn't come here, if I had just signed those papers." "If you had signed those papers, Sonia," I said, "Leon would still be running. He would have sold the land, spent the money, and found another bridge to park on next year." I walked over to her and gently took the bag of peas from her hand. The towel was damp from the melting ice. "This isn't your fault. Leon was running toward this bridge for 20 years. He just finally found a reason to park the car." I turned to Tess. "Tess, take Sonia up to your old room. There are clean sheets in the linen closet in the hall. Give her some of your sweatpants to sleep in." Tess stood up, her face wet with tears, but she didn't argue. She took Sonia by her uninjured arm and led her slowly out of the kitchen and up the stairs. Their footsteps were quiet on the carpeted risers, the soft murmur of Tess's voice offering a quiet comfort that belonged more to her nursing shift than to her childhood. Gavin and I were left alone. He walked over to the table, picked up the manila envelope containing the fake license and the deeds, and closed the flap. "He's not in the river, Mom," Gavin said, looking at me. "I know," I said. "He's probably at a motel in Easton or Bethlehem. Waiting for the news to hit the local paper," he said. "He's waiting to see if we break." "I know," I said again. I took the manila envelope from his hand and tucked it into the drawer of the side table next to the cork coasters. "But tomorrow is Sunday, Gavin, and on Monday we're still meeting with Marianne." Sunday morning arrived with a pale, watery light that did nothing to warm the kitchen. The mist had cleared, leaving the trees bare and wet, their dark branches silhouetted against a sky the color of a wet slate. Sonia left at 8 with Tess. She was wearing one of Tess's oversized gray sweaters and a pair of dark sweatpants, her injured wrist bandaged neatly with a clean white wrap Tess had brought from the clinic. The solidarity between them was quiet, almost wordless. Tess drove her to the township police station so Sonia could make her formal statement and have her wrist photographed for the assault charge. They looked like two sisters as they walked to the blue sedan, their heads ducked against the damp morning air. Once they were gone, Gavin turned to me. He was drinking a cup of black coffee, his eyes dark with exhaustion. "We need to go up there, Mom," he said, gesturing toward the stairs that led to the room over the garage. "I know," I said. The wooden stairs on the side of the garage were slick with moisture. I held the railing tight, my boots making a dull, hollow thud on each step. I hadn't been up here in 3 years, not since Leon had declared the room his private thinking space and installed a padlock on the inside of the door. He had kept the key on his personal ring, but last night, in his haste to flee Sonia's apartment, he had left his work keys lying on the mahogany side table in the living room. I turned the brass key in the lock. The door opened with a dry, protesting creak. The room smelled of cold ash, stale coffee, and the damp, sweet smell of old paper. It was cluttered in a way that the main house never was. Leon's desk, a cheap mahogany veneer he had bought at an office supply liquidation sale, was covered in piles of unopened mail, dusty legal pads, and empty plastic water bottles. On the small wood stove in the corner sat a cold iron kettle, its lid covered in a thin layer of gray soot. A man's private drawers are like the bottom of a dry well. They contain only the things he was too afraid to show the sun. Gavin went directly to the desk. He didn't hesitate. He pulled out his pocket knife and used the small screwdriver attachment to pop the cheap lock on the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. The metal gave a sharp, wet snap, and the drawer slid open with a heavy rattle. Inside were dozens of folders, their tabs labeled in Leon's neat, architectural block lettering. Gavin began to flip through them, his fingers moving quickly, pulling out tax returns, bank statements, and corporate documents for Vance Consulting. "Here," Gavin said, pulling a thick blue folder from the back of the drawer. "This isn't bank paperwork, Mom." He laid the folder on the desk blotter. The label read, Summit Development Group, LLC. I leaned over his shoulder as he opened the folder. Inside was a document titled Letter of Intent to Purchase Real Estate. It was dated October 12th, less than 2 weeks ago. I read the document, my eyes scanning the dense legal paragraphs. Summit Development Group, a commercial developer based in Allentown, was offering to purchase our house and the surrounding 3 acres of land for $450,000. The property was situated near the junction of Route 9, which had recently been rezoned for light commercial use. The closing date was scheduled for November 15th. "They're going to tear it down," Gavin whispered, his finger running along the clause that specified the demolition of all existing structures within 30 days of closing. "They want to build a medical clinic and a parking lot."
But it was the last page of the contract that made my breath catch in my throat. There was a line for Leon's signature, which he had already signed in dark blue ink, and below it, a line for my signature. There was a small pink sticky note attached to the line, written in Leon's hand. "Maren to sign Sunday, October 25th. Peters to notarize." Today was Sunday, October 25th. Leon's mobile notary had never been for the back acre. It had been for the entire estate. He was planning to sell the house right from under me, using a forged signature to transfer the deed to Summit Development, pocket the $450,000, and disappear before the moving trucks arrived in November. He had built his entire escape around this Sunday morning. The phone in my pocket buzzed. It was a text from Tess. I pulled it out, my fingers cold against the glass screen. "Mom, we're at the police station. Officer Raymond just came back in. They found something else near the bridge." I dialed Tess's number immediately. The call rang twice before she answered. Her voice hushed, the background hum of the police station lobby audible behind her. "Tess," I said, "what did they find?" "They found his winter coat, Mom," she whispered. "The navy one with the leather collar. It was caught on some willow branches about 50 yards downstream from the bridge. It was completely soaked." She paused, and I heard her take a long, unsteady breath. "But that's not everything," she continued, her voice turning from fear to a strange, flat coldness. "Officer Raymond said the state police checked the surveillance cameras at the toll plaza and the bus terminal in Easton. They have a man matching Dad's description on camera at midnight. He was wearing a dark gray windbreaker, the one he keeps in the trunk of his car for golf. He bought a one-way ticket to New York City. He had thrown his winter coat into the river to give us a body to grieve, then walked to the bus station in his windbreaker." "I see," I said. "A liar who has run out of time will always try to die a little, hoping that the morning will distract you from the theft." Leon had wanted us to spend our Sunday weeping, identified by our grief, while he sat on an interstate bus heading north, his pockets lined with whatever cash he had managed to scrape from his LLC's remaining accounts. "Tess," I said, "are you still with Sonia?" "Yes," she said, "we're just finishing up the paperwork. Sonia's dad is coming to pick her up from the station. He's driving down from Stroudsburg." "Good," I said. "Once you're done, come back here. Gavin and I found something in the room over the garage. We need to show you." "Is it bad?" she asked. "It's the truth, Tess," I said. "And the truth is never bad. It's just heavy." I hung up the phone. Gavin was standing by the window of the garage room, looking out at the bare branches of the maples. The gray light of the morning caught the side of his face, making him look remarkably like my father, steady, unhurried,
a man who didn't look for trouble but knew exactly what to do when it arrived. "He went to New York," Gavin said, without turning around. "Yes," I said. "He threw his navy coat in the river first." Gavin gave a short, humorless laugh. "Of course he did. He always loved a theatrical exit. He probably stood on that bridge for 10 minutes, adjusting the collar just right so it would catch on the branch where the searchlights would hit it." He walked back to the desk and picked up the Summit Development folder. "What do we do with this, Mom? The contract says the closing is November 15th. Today is the day he was supposed to have the forged signature notarized by Arthur Peters." "We call Arthur Peters," I said. "Peters?" Gavin looked at me, his brow furrowing. "He's Dad's accomplice. He notarized the second mortgage. He notarized it because Leon told him I was too ill to sign it myself, or because Leon paid him," I said. "But Arthur Peters has a license to practice accounting in this state, Gavin. He has a wife, 3 children, and a brick house in Allentown with a clean lawn. He is not going to go to prison for forgery to protect a man who is currently sitting on a bus to Manhattan." I picked up the office phone on Leon's desk. It was an old landline, the plastic faded to a dull cream. I dialed the number for Peter's home office, which I had memorized years ago when I used to handle Leon's scheduling. The phone rang 4 times before a man answered. His voice was thick with Sunday morning sleepiness. "Peters," he said. "Arthur," I said, my voice perfectly calm, perfectly polite. "It's Maren Vance." A long, heavy silence followed on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock from his office, a sound that seemed to mirror the grandfather clock in my own hallway. "Maren," he said, his voice suddenly tight, the sleepiness instantly vanishing. I didn't expect to hear from you today. Leon said you were, he said you were unavailable." "I'm available, Arthur," I said. "In fact, I'm sitting in Leon's office right now. I have the Summit Development contract in front of me, the one you were scheduled to notarize at 9 o'clock this morning." I heard the dry scrape of a chair on the other end of the line. "Maren, look. Leon told me you had discussed the terms. He said you were in agreement." "Arthur," I said gently, "if you notarize my signature on this contract today, or if you notarize any other document with my name on it, without me standing in your office with my physical identification, I will file a formal complaint with the State Licensing Board before noon tomorrow. And then my son and I will take the second mortgage deed, the one you notarized while I was on a ventilator at St. Luke's, to the county prosecutor." I paused, letting the silence carry the weight of the words. "I don't think you want to go to prison for Leon, Arthur," I added softly. "He doesn't even have enough money to pay your retainer." On the other end of the line, Arthur Peters let out a long, ragged breath. I could hear his fingers tapping nervously against his desk, a fast, dry sound like an insect trapped in a jar. "Maren, please," he said, his voice dropping into a desperate, pleading register. "I didn't know you were in the hospital. I swear to God I didn't know. Leon brought the papers to my office. He said you signed them at home because your knee was giving you too much pain to travel. He's been my client for 10 years, Maren. I had no reason to doubt him." "You had every legal reason, Arthur," I said, my voice remaining perfectly level, perfectly soft. "You're a notary public. Your license requires you to physically witness the signing. You chose to accept Leon's word because he promised you a cut of the consultancy fee once the equity line cleared." Peters didn't deny it, He couldn't. The silence that followed was the silence of a man who had just realized his entire career was hanging by a single, thin thread of my tolerance. "What do you want?" he whispered. "I want a written, signed statement," I said, "detailing exactly how Leon obtained your notary stamp for the second mortgage and admitting that I was not present in your office when the deed was executed. You will scan that statement and email it to my lawyer, Marianne, by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I'll text you her email address." "And if I do?" "If you do," I said, "I will let Marianne handle the bank. We'll present your statement to their fraud department. It will be up to them whether they pursue criminal charges against you, but I will not file a separate complaint with the state board." "Okay," Peter said, his voice shaking. "Okay, Maren, I'll do it. I'll write it now. Just, please don't call the police on me today. My wife, she has a heart condition. She can't handle this." "Write the statement, Arthur," I said, and hung up the phone. I set the receiver back on the cradle. Gavin was watching me from the desk, a faint, dry smile on his face, the first real smile I had seen on him since he arrived on Saturday morning. "You're very good at this, Mom," he said softly. "I'm not good at it, Gavin," I said, walking toward the door. "I've just had 30 years of practice, watching your father do it. You learn the steps after a while." We walked back down the wooden stairs of the garage. The rain had completely stopped, but the dampness had settled into the grass, making each step heavy and wet. By the time we reached the back door of the kitchen, Tess's sedan was pulling into the driveway. She got out of the car alone. She looked drained, her yellow scrubs wrinkled, her dark hair pulled back into a messy bun that had begun to unravel. She walked into the kitchen, sat down at the table, and rested her forehead against the cool pine wood. "Sonia's dad picked her up," Tess said, without looking up. "He was really nice to her. He didn't yell. He just took her bag and put his arm around her. It made me feel, I don't know, strange." Gavin sat down next to her, placing the blue Summit Development folder on the table between them. "Tess, you need to look at this." She lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen. She opened the folder and began to read. I watched her face as she reached the clause about the demolition, the $95,000, the November 15th closing date. The final illusion died slowly. You could see it in the way her shoulders sank, the way her hand went to her mouth to stifle a small, dry sob. "He was going to sell it," she whispered. "He was going to let them tear down the house, the tire swing, the garden, the room where we used to do our homework. He was going to turn it into a parking lot."
"He was going to turn it into cash, Tess," Gavin said, "and then he was going to New York." Before Tess could answer, the phone on the kitchen counter began to ring. In the quiet of the room, the sound was loud, almost violent. We all looked at the caller ID screen. It was an unknown number, but the area code was 212, Manhattan. Gavin reached for the receiver, but I held up my hand, stopping him. "I'll take it," I said. I picked up the phone. I didn't say hello. I just held the receiver to my ear, listening to the static of the line, waiting. "Maren?" It was Leon. His voice sounded different, not angry, not confident, but thin and reedy, accompanied by the low, distant rumble of traffic and the hiss of air brakes. He was calling from a street phone or a cheap burner. "Maren, please," he said,
his tone instantly shifting into that soft, manipulative register he used when he wanted me to feel responsible for his survival. "You have to help me. I'm in a bad place. I don't have anywhere to go." I held the receiver to my ear. Through the static, I could hear the wet, heavy hiss of traffic on a Manhattan street, the low metallic rumble of the subway running beneath the pavement, the sharp, distant beep of a yellow cab's horn. Leon's breath was shallow, a dry, fluttering sound against the speaker. "Maren," he said, his voice dropping into that familiar, husky whisper he used when he was trying to create an artificial intimacy between us. "You have to understand. The Summit deal. It was the only way to save us. If they foreclose, we get nothing. The bank takes the house, and we're left with the debt. But with Summit, we get $450,000. We can pay off the equity line, pay the back taxes, and there will still be enough for you to get that place by the marina. We can both start over." "The marina townhouse is $280,000, Leon," I said. "And the demolition clause in the Summit contract says the house must be leveled within 30 days of closing. You weren't saving the family. You were selling the dirt we stand on." "It's just wood and plaster, Maren," he hissed, his tone suddenly turning sharp, his frustration leaking through the cracks of his helplessness. "You've always been so sentimental about this place. It's an albatross. It's been draining my business accounts for 5 years just to keep the roof from leaking. If you would just cooperate, if you would let Arthur notarize the document, we could have the funds escrowed by Friday." "Arthur Peters is writing a confession, Leon," I said. "He's sending it to my lawyer at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." The line went completely silent. The traffic noise on his end seemed to fade, as if the city itself had gone quiet, waiting for his response. "What?" he whispered. "I called him," I said. "He knows about the hospital records from St. Luke's. He knows I have the cancellation deed for the original mortgage. He isn't going to lose his notary license to protect a man who threw his winter coat in the river." I heard a sharp, ragged intake of breath. You told the police?" "They have you on camera at the Easton bus station, Leon," I said. "They know you bought a one-way ticket to New York. They're not looking for a body in the river anymore. They're looking for you." "Maren, please," he whimpered. The anger was gone now, replaced by that pathetic, wet desperation that had always made me feel a cold, heavy guilt. "Don't do this to me. I'm 60 years old. I can't survive in a state facility. My blood pressure. You know what the doctor said about my sodium levels. If I go in there, I'll die. Is that what you want? To tell the children you put their father in a cage?" Before I could answer, Tess stood up from the table. She walked over to me, her hand reaching out for the receiver. Her face was very pale, her eyes red, but her fingers were steady. "Let me speak to him," she said. I looked at her for a second, then handed her the black plastic handset. She held it to her ear, her shoulders squaring as she took a deep, quiet breath. "Dad," she said. On the other end of the line, I heard Leon's voice rise in a sudden, frantic wave of hope. "Tess! Tess, sweetheart! Thank God! You have to tell your mother to stop this. She's out of her mind. She's going to ruin the family. You know I love you, Tess. Everything I did to make sure you and Gavin had a future. I was going to use the summit money to help you with the down payment on that condo you wanted. I swear, Tess, I was." Tess listened to him. She didn't interrupt. She let him spin his last frantic web of promises, her face remaining entirely still, her eyes fixed on the green-trimmed plates sitting on the counter. "I saw the contract, Dad," she said, when he finally paused to breathe. Her voice was very quiet, very flat, the voice of a nurse giving a terminal diagnosis to a patient who already knew the truth. "I saw the date you signed it. You signed it the day after you left me at the clinic because you said you were too busy to help me change my flat tire. You were in Allentown, signing our childhood away to a commercial developer." "Tess, please." "Don't call this house again, Dad," she said. "And don't call my phone. If you do, I'll be the one who goes to Officer Raymond with the statement about Sonia's wrist. I took the photographs myself before we left the station. I know how to document an assault, Dad. I do it every week at the clinic." She didn't wait for him to answer. She reached out and pressed the button on the cradle, cutting the line with a sharp plastic click. She set the receiver down. She stood there by the counter for a long moment, her hand resting on the phone, her chest rising and falling with a slow, heavy rhythm. Gavin walked over to her, put his arm around her shoulder, and pulled her in. She didn't cry this time. She just leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her eyes closed as the silence of the kitchen settled back around us. Sunday night passed in a quiet, heavy suspension. For the first time in 5 years, I slept in my own bed without listening for the sound of Leon's footsteps in the hallway or the low, dry rumble of his voice through the ceiling as he paced the floor of the room over the garage. The house felt larger, colder, but the air was clear. The smell of Sonia's vanilla cream had finally faded, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of the rain-washed cedar outside. At 8:30 on Monday morning, Gavin, Tess, and I walked into the offices of Vance & Associate, not Leon's firm, but the legal practice of Marianne Curtis, located in a restored brick building on Main Street. Marianne was a woman of my own generation, with sharp, dark eyes, gray-streaked hair cut into a sensible bob, and a manner that was entirely free of professional pretense. Her office smelled of old beeswax, hot coffee, and the dry, comforting scent of thick paper. She sat behind a large oak desk, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, as she went through the documents Gavin had printed out. Arthur Peters' statement had arrived in her inbox at exactly 8:15, a PDF document signed and witnessed, detail-rich, and entirely cooperative. "Peters saved himself," Marianne said, tapping her finger against the printed email. "By admitting he notarized the second mortgage without your physical presence, he's hoping the state board will suspend his license for a year rather than revoke it permanently. And he's given us exactly what we need for the bank." "What happens to the $95,000? Tess asked, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "The bank's fraud department will initiate an internal investigation," Marianne said, looking over her glasses at Tess. "They will look at the notary's confession, the hospital records from St. Luke's, and the handwriting analysis. Once they determine the signature was forged, they will declare the second mortgage voidable. The bank will have to pursue Leon personally for the recovery of the funds. They cannot foreclose on this house, Maren. The title is clean. I felt a sudden physical easing in my chest, a quiet, deep shift, like the ground thawing after a hard winter. For 30 years I had held my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for Leon's grand, expensive schemes to finally break the structure of our lives. And the Summit Development contract? Gavin asked. I'm sending a certified letter to their legal department at noon, Marianne said, a small, grim smile touching her lips. I'll attach a copy of the deed registry, Peter's statement, and a formal notice that the co-owner's signature was forged. Summit is a commercial developer, Gavin. They want to build a clinic and a parking lot. They do not want to buy into a 3-year title dispute with a local family. They will withdraw their offer before the close of business today. She took off her glasses, letting them hang from the silver chain around her neck, and looked at me. There was no pity in her eyes, only a deep, quiet respect. You've done a remarkable job, Maren, she said. Most women in your position would have signed the papers just to make the noise go away. You stayed quiet, but you didn't yield. I stayed quiet because I was tired, Marianne, I said softly. But there's a difference between being quiet and being invisible. A legal document is just a story told in a language that doesn't allow for excuses, Marianne said. Once you strip away the emotion, the truth is remarkably simple. Before we could stand to leave, the small black phone on Marianne's desk buzzed. Her assistant's voice came through the speaker, low and slightly hurried. Marianne? I have Officer Raymond from the Township Police on line 2. He says he needs to speak with Mrs. Vance. Marianne looked at me, her hand hovering over the blinking red light on the console. I nodded. She pressed the button and turned on the speakerphone. Officer Raymond, Marianne said. This is Marianne Curtis. I have Maren Vance and her children in my office. Mrs. Vance? Raymond's voice came through, static thin but clear. I wanted to let you know that we've received an update from the Port Authority Police in New York. Leon Vance was located about an hour ago. Tess leaned forward, her face turning very pale. Is he okay? He's alive, ma'am, Raymond said. He was taken into custody at a boarding house near the Port Authority terminal. He was trying to board a bus for Fort Lauderdale under a false name. He's currently being held at the Manhattan Detention Facility on the fugitive warrant we issued last night. The legal resolution of Leon's affairs was a quiet, paper-thin process that took place in small rooms over the next 3 weeks. There were no dramatic courtroom confrontations, no tears, and no late-night confessions. Arthur Peters' written statement, combined with the hospital records from St. Luke's and the mobile notary's panic-stricken testimony, left the bank's fraud division with very little to investigate. By the first week of November, the second mortgage was officially declared void, the title was cleared, and Summit Development Group had quietly withdrawn its offer to purchase the land, citing unforeseen title complications. Leon remained in the detention facility in Manhattan, waiting for his extradition to Pennsylvania on charges of forgery, grand larceny, and identity theft. He had called Tess once more, but she had blocked the number before the automated operator could finish asking if she would accept the collect call charges. Neither Tess nor Gavin offered with his bail, and his sister in Scranton refused to take his calls.
The man who had spent 30 years trying to be the largest, most indispensable figure in our lives had finally shrunk to a single blue ink listing on a county court docket. On the second Sunday of November, the first light snow of the season began to fall. It was a quiet, lazy snow, the large white flakes drifting slowly down from a pale lavender-gray sky, melting the moment they touched the damp, dark soil of the hydrangea beds where Gavin and I had spread the lime. The leaves were all gone now, leaving the woods behind the house open and silver, the small creek at the edge of the property a dark, winding thread through the gray trunks of the birch trees. Gavin had driven back to Boston the night before. He had kissed my cheek, his face smelling of cold air and peppermint, and told me he would be back for Thanksgiving. Tess had spent the morning packing the last of her old bedroom things into cardboard boxes. She had signed a lease on a small garden apartment 2 miles from the clinic, a place with large windows and a small concrete patio where she planned to put her own flower pots. I stood at the back door watching her blue sedan pull out of the driveway, its tires leaving 2 dark, wet tracks in the light dusting of snow on the gravel. She didn't look back, and I didn't expect her to. She was 27, and she was finally starting her own life, free of the invisible, heavy debts of her father's pride. The house was completely still. I walked through the kitchen, which smelled of toasted bread and the damp wool of my sweater. I put my empty mug in the sink, washed it with a small wooden brush, and dried it before placing it in the cupboard. Then I walked into the living room. The grandfather clock stood in the hallway, its dark cherry wood catching the dim silver light from the window. The painted moon phase dial was still set to the waning crescent, its gold face tilted slightly to the side. I reached up to the top of the casing, my fingers finding the cool brass winding key. I didn't wind it. I left the key resting behind the carving. The weights inside the dark trunk were low, almost touching the bottom of the wooden case. By midnight, the pendulum would give its last heavy swing, the brass gears would click, and the steady, rhythmic ticking that had filled this house for 80 years would finally stop. I walked over to the bay window and sat down in the green velvet armchair. The room was cold, but I didn't turn up the thermostat. I pulled my mother's old wool blanket over my knees, my fingers tracing the thin, worn velvet on the left armrest where my palm had rested through so many long, silent mornings. Beside me, on the mahogany side table, the white ring where Sonia's tea mug had sat was still there, a pale, circular scar on the dark wood. I hadn't rubbed it with mineral oil today. I would leave it there, a quiet mark of the woman who had sat in my chair just long enough to help me see the foundation of my own house. I looked out at the empty driveway, where the snow was slowly covering the dark tracks Tess's car had left behind, burying them under a clean, uniform blanket of white. I had spent 30 years holding everyone together, smoothing the sheets, keeping the peace, and protecting the illusions of a man who had never seen me standing in the room. I had believed that my silence was a gift I was giving to my family, a quiet sacrifice that kept the roof from falling in on the people I loved. But as I sat there in the quiet, empty room, listening to the slowing, indifferent heartbeat of the clock, I finally realized the truth. The roof hadn't stayed up because of my silence. It had stayed up because I had been the one carrying the walls. I leaned my head back against the worn green velvet, closed my eyes, and let my hands rest open on my lap. The house was cold, the rooms were empty, and the silence was absolute. But for the very first time in my life, I did not reach out to catch the falling pieces.